Folks, I hope you didn't plan on sitting still these next 3 months, because our theme for worship will focus on all the different ways that God is telling us to go out there and do something that makes a difference. Now, some of you are going to welcome that challenge. There are some members of the church who are up to any challenge and say, just point me in the right direction, Pastor, and I'll take care of it from there. But there are some of you who might be rolling your eyes because you feel like you've put in your time and have no creative juices left. And you say, well, it's maybe someone else's turn to go. But the truth is that God is always challenging us not to stay put, but to move out, to go. Now, I know that you must be getting tired of me referring to the journey of faith that we travel together. But I don't think there's any better way that we have to describe what we're to be about as Christians. Because there's no time when we can say that we have arrived. We never reach a point where we can say that we know it all, or that we've done all that we are to do, that we've done our share. God is always calling us out to experience and to share God's love with the world. So, we're going to be looking at some of the ways that God calls us to go in the weeks ahead. And I hope that as we go together, we'll also grow together as the people of God coming here to worship. As Jen shared with the kids, this morning we're going to start the series at the beginning. The creation stories in the Bible. And that makes sense. From the very beginning of things, God has called us to go and to create. Hopefully you got a sense of that as we read the creation story together from the book of Genesis this morning. In light of everything that's going on in the world around us right now, so much destruction, both natural and man-made, it might seem like this reading is a little bit out of touch with our situation and our circumstances today. What does the story about God's good creation have to say to folks who have just had all their possessions blown away or washed away by a storm coming from the sea onto dry land, both of which God created and called good? If they scoffed at the talk of the goodness of God in those circumstances, who could blame them? But there are a few things about this story from Genesis that you need to know. Even though it's a story about a timeless event, something that took place long ago at a time that we even call prehistory, this creation story was probably not written down in the form that we have it today until about 500 years before the birth of Christ. During a time when God's people were living in exile in Babylon. These people had lost everything. They'd lost their homes. They'd lost the land that God had promised them. Jerusalem had been conquered and destroyed. Even the temple had fallen, this beautiful dwelling place where God was supposed to have taken up his residence. It had been torn down. And after centuries of passing this creation story on by word of mouth, from generation to generation, in good times and challenging times, it would be now in exile, in the worst of times, that this creation story was written down. Probably sitting in a ramshackle house far from home in exile, with little or no hope of ever returning to their homes again, this believer still wrote this story of a good and a loving God who created everything and called creation good. Back then, as people heard the story, as they read the story, they were challenged, just like we're challenged, with everything that was happening to them as people of God, who were called, who were chosen as God's people. Could they still look around and call what they saw good? Maybe the question was asked, do you still believe your God is powerful enough to protect you? When you're in exile, can you let God go or let God grow, rethinking who God is in this strange and foreign land? And as I thought about that, it seemed to me that probably there's folks who are mucking out their flooded homes in Houston who are asking themselves that question. I can see residents in Florida watching the winds of Irma blow their possessions away, asking that question. I can see survivors of that earthquake in Mexico with their cities crumbling around them, asking that question. I can see people in Montana and Washington and Oregon and Idaho and California seeing hillsides in flames and homes being burned to the ground, asking that question. Is God still there? And can God protect me? You see, God's people in exile had to rethink what they believed about God. They had every reason to turn their backs on God. They had every reason to stop believing. They had every reason to ask where in the world God was through all of this. Where was God living now that his house had been destroyed, along with the rest of Jerusalem? But this time in exile gave them time to rethink, maybe as we say in our computer lingo, to reboot. And as this creation story was written down, as these spoken words were recorded, the answer that surfaced was yes. I do believe in this God who created everything and who called it good. This creation story is a poem. And it's all about beginnings. And there's a rhythm to the creation process. God spoke a word. The deed is done. And then God pronounced that it was good. Maybe you picked that up as we read it together. Over and over again, we read those words that God was moved to create, and the goodness and the love of God can be seen in what God created. And then, after the sixth day, that busy sixth day that saw earthbound creatures being created, including man, male and female, God looked around at everything, and he called it all good indeed. And then God rested. God rested, but the work of creation had just begun. And that work is still going on. God laid all that had been created at the feet of man, male and female. And he turned us loose to make something of it. We're told that you and I are part of an ongoing creative process. There's been a lot written about just what it means to subdue God's creation, because God has given us dominion over it. That's what the first creation story says. And that verse has been misused and sometimes misinterpreted to say that, we can do anything we want to this world around us because God gave it to us. It's a little bit different than what we read in creation part 2 in the second chapter of Genesis, when we're told by God that our job is to till and to keep the earth. In other words, to be good stewards, to treat the land, to treat creation well. No matter which verses you use to justify the way you see the world around you and your place in it, everything leads us back to our belief that God created. And in that creation process, God called it good. And God has given us a gift, and from the very beginning, God has challenged us to use that gift and to use it well. And that brings us back to how we see the goodness of creation in things like hurricanes and fires and earthquakes. Where is the good in any of that? And it depends on the response that we make. We were given a choice to subdue the land or to care for it. We've also been given the choice of how we will use the gifts God has given us to respond to a world that seems to be coming apart. How do we go and create something new and good in the midst of all of that? But if you've been watching the accounts of hurricanes and floods and all the rest, you've seen it happening already. You've seen hearts recreated. You've seen hearts made new as cameras captured people risking their lives to save others from flooding. And God looked at the choices that were being made, and he called them good. You've seen boats coming into South Texas from areas in the path of that same storm just so they could help others in need. And God looked at those choices that were being made, and God called them good. Suddenly, in this whole situation that calls us to respond, there is no red and blue. There is no black or white. There is no rich or poor. People were in need, and people reached out. Not because they had to, but because it was the right thing to do. It was the decent thing to do. And God looked at the choices that were being made, and God calls them good. Creation continues when you and I dare to step out, and not on our own, but let God's love change things through us. We don't have to wait for natural disasters to strike. Each one of you here can make little choices every day that can shine God's love into the dark shadows of someone else's life. And that person's life will be changed. That person's life will be made new, maybe just a little bit at a time. And there will be new creation. So go. You are children of God who created everything. You are children of God, and God has called you good. And because God is still creating in love, because God is still calling it good, anytime you reach out in love to heal someone who is hurting, God's creation moves forward. So go and create, because you are the hands and the heart of Jesus, reaching out into the world that needs to be loved and not judged. Go and let God create something good through you. Follow the sign. Go. Amen. Would you pray with me? Lord God, all things belong to you. All things have been created by you, through you. We exist in you. And the power of your love resides in us. In that creative process that still continues, may we find our place to contribute. In those places in our lives where we need to be recreated, where we need to be made new. May that creation process begin. And may we see the glory of what you have done. And may we call it all good in Jesus' name.